Have you ever broken the law? Okay, don't lie. Come on. Have you ever jaywalked, shoplifted, maybe downloaded an illegal movie? Well, we've all been there. Just make sure you do those things occasionally because, according to research, if you do them too often, you become desensitized to your own morality. Desensitized enough to consider something like robbing a bank. But what if you could avoid all the work involved in being a common criminal and still get rich? What if someone else did the hard work for you and all you had to do was sit back and collect your cut? And that's why when a new family moves into a favela, they're usually welcomed with open arms and open doors. You see, it's considered rude in Brazil to keep your door locked. And if you have a guest, it's polite to let them come inside your home. Now, I know that sounds absolutely insane, but remember, this is about community. It's about family. It's about trust. They chose a spot where a utility pipe crossed under the bank and began digging downward. But every weekend, the crew retreated back to the tunnel entrance, picked up more tools and supplies, and continued their excavation. There were no signs, no warning, no evidence that a crew of criminals had been tunneling beneath a major bank in the city center. And here's the best part. Our crew made sure they didn't dig anywhere near the bank's surveillance cameras. So even if someone had spotted the hole in the ground above their heads, nobody would have thought anything of it. They were literally invisible. Again, they worked in the dark. It was pitch black. You couldn't see each other, couldn't see the mountains of cash surrounding them. All they could see was the faint glow of the lights marking their path to the surface. All in all, they dug about 25 feet deep. They installed drainage systems, ventilation, electrical. He was charged and sent to jail. But that's small comfort, considering only 8 million of the 70 million was ever recovered. The rest, well, nobody knows. Maybe it's hidden. Maybe it's laundered. Maybe it's buried beneath somebody else's vault. We'll never know. It was one of the biggest heists in history. It was also one of the most brazen, almost comical. How could such a thing happen? They knew what materials to bring. They knew how to avoid detection. It was an inside job. How could a bunch of construction workers tunnel beneath a heavily guarded bank without anyone noticing? Well, it came down to planning, patience, and timing. They made it so comfortable. It was like a luxurious underground parking garage. They worked during the day when the noise of traffic drowned out their jackhammers. Now, authorities did catch up with some of the suspects. They seized a few $1 million worth of assets. They uncovered secret bank accounts. But the masterminds behind the heist remained free. And by working slowly and steadily, they were able to minimize vibrations that might have set off seismic alarms inside the bank. If you enjoyed this episode, I invite you to check out my podcast. Thanks for watching. Plus, they had inside knowledge. Someone from within the bank had given them the exact coordinates of the vault. They knew where to dig. At first, it was slow going. They hit solid rock. But once they broke through, they were able to dig faster. They used wheelbarrows, and they passed dirt up through the ventilation shafts. And eventually, they reached the bedrock, which was soft sand. And that's when the real work began. If you have a neighbor you don't like, well, that's rare. Most of the time, your neighbors are going to be some of the most important people in your life. So yeah, having an open door policy does make sense. And every Friday, our crew of landscapers watched those employees leave. Each employee wore a badge that emitted an electronic signal. And if you didn't have a badge close to you, the alarm would sound. So our crew had to hurry. But they worked methodically. First, they cracked the concrete with a hydraulic drill. They used explosives to break the remaining concrete. They hooked up generators and angle grinders and buzzed through the bars that protected the vault. By the time they reached the vault floor, it was 6 a.m. Saturday morning. They had worked for 11 hours, and now it was time to collect their money. They knew the security system kicked in at 2 p.m. sharp, and that meant the vault was sealed and the alarm was armed. After 2 p.m., they had to act fast. So every Friday, they rushed to the tunnel entrance, grabbed their equipment, and raced into the darkness below the city. Sounds too good to be true, right? Well, it was. They exchanged dinner invitations and favors. But in the favelas of Brazil, it's a way of life, lined reinforced, with air vents and lights. They were far from home. They wanted to fit in. But there was one thing the crew never seemed to do, and that was work. A 260-foot tunnel reinforced with wood and plastic. It featured air shafts and ventilation. It had its own lighting system. It had graded walls. It was so stable, police later said, it could have supported the weight of a small car. And it went straight from the humble abode of a landscaping crew in the middle of a Brazilian favela straight into the vault of the Central Bank of Brazil. They did drive around in a truck with shovels and rakes and hoses, but they never went anywhere. I mean, they were supposed to be landscapers. Where were the gardens? Where were the trees? Where was the grass? Well, that's because this crew wasn't actually landscaping at all. They were excavating. Which brings us back to the year 2005. In the beginning of August, a group of men moved into a favela on the outskirts of Fortaleza. They were working for a local landscaping company, and they claimed to be installing sod in the yard of a house that was being renovated. In 2005, it was the third largest robbery in the world. The men were polite, friendly, always smiling. They spoke casually with the residents. They helped people with their groceries. Before long, everyone in the neighborhood felt like they were friends with the crew. In 2005, a group of men dug a tunnel, not a small one, a 260-foot tunnel. Back in 2005, it was home to 2.4 million Brazilians. Today, it's home to 2.7 million people, plus dozens of sprawling favelas on the outskirts of town. If you're not familiar with a favela, it's essentially a self-built community of low-income housing. Of course, they were friendly. They were immigrants looking for work. Here in North America, we would call them slums. But the word favela is uniquely Brazilian. It comes from the Portuguese word for shack. And that's exactly what you'll find in a favela, shacks made of whatever materials are available. For the residents of Fortaleza's favelas, that's often corrugated metal sheets and concrete scraps. It ran beneath 2 city blocks, straight into the vault of the Central Bank of Brazil. They worked for 3 months pretending to be landscapers, paid rent, planted grass, smiled at their neighbors. Then one weekend in August, they vanished with over 70 million Brazilian reais. That's 33 million USD in cash. This is the story of the Brazilian heist. Today, it's all but forgotten in the news archives. But what makes this story special is that the way this crew executed their plan means that even if you are unusually interested in crime, you might want to pay attention. Because if any of these guys had offered you a seat in their crew, you probably would have taken it. Our story takes place in Fortaleza, a city in northeast Brazil. The residents are generally poor and unemployed. But when you live in a favela, it's expected that you look after your neighbors and form tight bonds of community. Now, in any other neighborhood in the world, an open-door policy is a ticket to having your stuff stolen. And now that I think about it, that's not very suspicious at all. And what they were digging was a tunnel. See, below their feet, there was a subterranean masterpiece in the making. See, while our crew of landscapers were making friends, they were also surveying their surroundings. It took 3 months to dig the full 260 feet. The reason this was such a brilliant heist is that the tunnel was completely undetectable. Which brings us to Friday afternoon, August 5th, 2005. See, every Friday at 2 p.m., all the bank employees left work for the weekend. They worked quickly. They had only a few hours before the security guards arrived for their evening shift. They unloaded 3.5 tons of cash into carts, 40 millimeters rebar, the kind you'd use to reinforce concrete, and pushed those carts up the tunnel and into the waiting trucks. By the time the sun rose Saturday morning, the vault was empty. You see, the crew timed their excavations to coincide with the bank's busiest hours. The crew escaped without a trace. They vanished into thin air. Fast forward to 2019, and one of the suspects was finally nabbed. The lesson here is that criminals can be trusted even less than telemarketers with psychic powers. Don't say I didn't warn you. This has been the story of the Brazilian heist.